A young monk sits alone in a cold room in Wittenberg. He believes his soul is in danger. Every prayer feels insufficient. Every confession feels incomplete. Years later, that same man would fracture the authority of the Catholic Church, ignite religious wars across Europe, and permanently alter the psychology of Western civilization. His name was Martin Luther, but the movement he created began long before the famous hammer and nails. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, in what is now Germany. His father was ambitious, disciplined, and demanding. Hans Luther wanted social advancement. He worked in mining and slowly built enough stability to imagine something greater for his son. Martin was expected to become a lawyer, not a monk, not a reformer, certainly not a revolutionary. The household Luther grew up in was strict, even by the standards of the late Middle Ages. Punishment was common. Obedience was expected. Religion was not comforting. It was fearful. God was presented less as a source of love and more as a final judge, watching every human weakness. That atmosphere mattered. From an early age, Luther developed an intense awareness of guilt and failure. Friends and later observers described him as emotionally extreme, brilliant, sensitive, easily overwhelmed by fear. He experienced deep mood swings. He obsessed over sin. Small moral failures felt catastrophic to him. This would later become central to his theology. But first, it became central to his psychology. At university, Luther was intelligent and disciplined. He followed the path his father wanted. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1505, while traveling near Stotternheim, Luther was caught in a violent thunderstorm. Lightning struck nearby. Terrified, he cried out to Saint Anne, promising that if he survived, he would become a monk. He kept the promise. His father was furious. The decision looked irrational, emotional, even cowardly. But for Luther, the monastery was not escape. It was a desperate attempt at certainty. Inside the Augustinian monastery, Luther pushed himself relentlessly. He fasted excessively. He prayed for hours. He confessed constantly, sometimes for 6 hours at a time, yet nothing worked. Peace never came. The more he searched for spiritual perfection, the more impossible perfection seemed. This created a psychological tension that would define his life. Luther wanted absolute certainty in a world that offered none. The Church of the early 16th century operated through ritual, hierarchy, and gradual redemption. Luther wanted something immediate, total, final. Eventually, he became a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. There, while studying the writings of St. Paul, Luther experienced what he later described as a breakthrough. He became convinced that salvation came through faith alone, not through human effort or purchased forgiveness. At first, this was a personal revelation. Then, it became an intellectual weapon. The Catholic Church at the time was deeply powerful, but also deeply political. Popes acted like monarchs. Church offices were bought and sold. Massive construction projects required enormous funding. One of those projects was St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To finance it, the Church expanded the sale of indulgences. These were documents said to reduce punishment for sin. Officially, indulgences were more complex than simple forgiveness for money transactions. But in practice, many ordinary people believed they could purchase spiritual security. One preacher in particular pushed Luther toward confrontation. Johann Tetzel traveled through German territories, selling indulgences with theatrical intensity. According to later accounts, Tetzel promoted the idea that as soon as money entered the collection box, souls would rise from purgatory to Luther. This was not only corrupt, it was spiritually dangerous. In 1517, he published the 95 Theses. Contrary to popular myth, the dramatic image of Luther hammering them onto the church door may not have happened exactly as later generations imagined. But the symbolic impact became enormous. Printing technology amplified everything. Within weeks, Luther's arguments spread across Germany, then across Europe. This was the real turning point. Not just religious disagreement, a complete shift in authority. For centuries, truth had flowed downward from institutions. Luther redirected it inward. Scripture over hierarchy. Personal conviction over centralized control. Individual conscience over inherited authority. Many people saw liberation in that idea. Others saw chaos. Luther quickly discovered that criticism of corruption could evolve into political power. Princes protected him because weakening Rome strengthened their own independence. Scholars celebrated him. Common people projected hopes onto him that extended far beyond theology. And Luther himself began changing. At first he appeared uncertain and humble, still fearful, still introspective, but public influence alters perception, especially when millions begin treating a person as a symbol. The famous confrontation at the Diet of Worms in 1521 captured this transformation. Summoned before imperial authorities and ordered to recant his writings, Luther refused. "Here I stand," he supposedly declared. Whether those exact words were spoken remains debated, but the mythology mattered more than the transcript. The monk, terrified of divine judgment, was becoming something else entirely. A man convinced of his own historical role. After Worms, Luther was hidden in Wartburg Castle for protection. There he translated the New Testament into German. This was revolutionary in itself. Ordinary people could now access Scripture directly in their own language. The environment around Luther also changed rapidly. Reform movements spread unpredictably. Some groups demanded radical social equality. Others attacked church property. Violence erupted. This created one of the most revealing moments in Luther's life. In 1524, German peasants launched widespread revolts, partly inspired by reformist language about freedom and justice. Initially, Luther showed sympathy toward some complaints, but once the uprisings became violent, he turned sharply against them. His response was brutal. He urged rulers to suppress the revolts forcefully. Tens of thousands died. This revealed a contradiction that often appears in revolutionary figures. Luther challenged authority when he lacked power, but once his movement gained institutional support, disorder threatened him personally. Stability became more important than idealism. Power had changed. The reformer, the same man who demanded freedom from spiritual tyranny, now feared social fragmentation. His writings became harsher, more rigid, more combative. This pattern repeats throughout history. Movements born from moral conviction often evolve into systems concerned primarily with preserving themselves. Revolutionary leaders frequently become defenders of order once instability begins threatening their position. The French Revolution would later follow similar psychological dynamics. So would 20th century ideological movements. Initial liberation slowly transforms into enforcement. Certainty becomes identity. Identity becomes intolerance. Luther was not immune to this pattern. As his influence expanded, criticism affected him differently. Early in life, criticism intensified his self-doubt. Later, insulation from criticism hardened his certainty. Supporters increasingly surrounded him. Political allies protected him. Admirers treated him as a chosen figure. Over time, this environment reduced the corrective pressure that keeps judgment balanced. His later writings reflected this shift. He became increasingly hostile toward opponents. His attacks on rival theologians grew personal and vicious. Most controversially, his later writings about Jewish communities were deeply hateful and destructive. Though rooted partly in medieval religious hostility, the intensity of Luther's language shocked even some contemporaries. This darker phase matters because it shows how moral certainty can deteriorate when combined with power and isolation. Luther genuinely believed he was defending truth. That belief made compromise feel immoral. Once someone becomes convinced, they alone see reality clearly. Opposition no longer appears legitimate. It appears dangerous. Psychologically, Luther's life reveals a man driven by internal conflict more than ambition. Unlike many historical power figures, he did not initially seek political control. He sought relief from anxiety. But history rarely leaves influential people unchanged. The young monk searching for grace gradually became a patriarch, defending a movement. The burden of leadership intensified traits already present within him. His certainty grew stronger. So did his anger. By the 1530s and 1540s, Europe itself had transformed. Protestant territories emerged across northern Europe. The authority of the Catholic Church fractured permanently. Religious wars loomed. Old structures weakened. Luther had not planned all of this. That is another important historical pattern. Individuals often unleash forces larger than their intentions. Once ideas enter society, they evolve independently from their creators. Luther spent his final years exhausted and physically weakened. He suffered from chronic health problems, kidney stones, heart issues, pain, depression. He remained intellectually active, but increasingly bitter. In 1546, he died in the same town where he had been born. But the consequences of his actions continued expanding long after his death. The Protestant Reformation permanently altered Western civilization. It reshaped education, literacy, politics, economics, and personal identity. Some historians argue it helped lay foundations for modern individualism itself. Yet Luther's legacy remains deeply complicated. He challenged corruption courageously. He democratized access to Scripture. He empowered personal conscience. At the same time, he contributed to division, intolerance, and cycles of religious conflict that devastated Europe for generations. That contradiction is precisely what makes him historically important. Martin Luther was neither saint nor villain in the simplistic sense. He was something more uncomfortable. A deeply flawed human being whose personal psychological struggle collided with a historical system already under pressure. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. History often celebrates certainty, but certainty is dangerous. The people most convinced they are serving truth can also become incapable of questioning themselves. Luther began as a man terrified of judgment. He spent years searching for freedom from fear. In the process, he helped create a world where individuals could challenge authority directly. But he also demonstrated how quickly liberation can harden into dogma once power enters the equation. In the end, Martin Luther did not simply change religion. He changed the relationship between the individual and authority itself. And once that relationship changes, history rarely returns to what it was before.